Mara Fontaine slammed her mother's recipe book onto the table, so hard the tin cups rattled, and three cowhands flinched back in their seats. "You want to tell me I can't cook for working men?" Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. Nothing about her shook, even though she hadn't eaten in 2 days and her boots had a hole clean through the left sole. "Then fire me, but do it after you taste what I just made. Because I guarantee you, not one man in this room is standing up from that table. If this one's already got you, stay with me to the end, and drop a comment telling me what town you're watching from tonight." This story traveled a lot farther than Mara Fontaine ever expected to go herself. The morning Mara arrived in Cottonwood Bend, Texas, the temperature was already climbing past 90 before 8 o'clock, and the dust off the road had turned everything the same flat color of dried bone. She stepped down from the wagon with her leather bag over one shoulder, and her mother's recipe book pressed against her chest like something she'd fight a man to keep, because she already had. 3 times over, and would again without hesitation. The wagon driver didn't offer to help her down. He'd stopped offering her anything by the second day of the trip. Once she'd made it clear she wasn't interested in the kind of conversation he kept trying to start. He'd been civil enough after that, which was all she'd ever asked of him. She didn't need kindness from strangers. She'd stopped expecting it a while back. She stood in the road and looked at Cottonwood Bend the way a person looks at something they've been warned about. Smaller than she'd expected, louder than she'd hoped, smelling of cattle and hot iron and something faintly rotten underneath both. A general store, a saloon with a broken window patched in burlap, a livery with its doors hanging open, a church at the far end that hadn't seen fresh paint in a decade. 2 women in pale dresses crossed the street ahead of her without a glance. A knot of men sat in the shade outside the saloon watching her, with the particular kind of attention that made her straighten her spine and stare right back until they looked away first. She had 39 cents in her bag. She had her mother's recipe book. She had one name, Weston Hale. That was the whole of what she had. 6 months earlier, Mara had owned more than this. Not much more, but more. A home in Savannah, a small restaurant her parents had built over 20 years of early mornings and late nights. A life that was worn thin and exhausting some days, but was fundamentally hers. Her father's laugh, her mother's handwriting filling page after page of that leather-bound book. The particular way afternoon light came through the restaurant windows and turned everything gold for about 45 minutes before it slipped away. None of that belonged to her anymore. The fire had come in October, 3 days after her father died of a fever that moved too fast to argue with. Her mother followed him 6 weeks later. And Mara had come to believe it wasn't grief exactly that killed her mother. It was the shock of discovering what grief felt like after 31 years of building a whole life around one person. And that person simply, irreversibly gone. Her mother had never had any practice being without him. The restaurant burned while Mara was still in the disoriented early weeks of mourning her mother, still waking every morning and reaching for a grief too large to hold properly. Her father's younger brother, a man named Roland Fontaine, a man who'd visited the family exactly 4 times in Mara's whole life and smelled permanently of hair oil and weak character, arrived within the week. He came with papers. He came with a lawyer. He came with the quiet confidence of a man who'd already decided how this was going to go and simply needed her signature in the right places. She hadn't signed. What followed was a long, ugly process she didn't like to revisit in detail, but the essential truth of it was this. Roland had more money, more connections, and more willingness to do things Mara found repellent, and in the end that had been enough. She'd walked out of a lawyer's office in Savannah with the clothes on her back, her leather bag, her mother's recipe book, and 39 cents that Roland's lawyer had apparently judged a fair settlement for a woman with no remaining male relatives and no deed in her name. She took the money. She took the book. She stood very still on the street for about a minute, deciding whether she was going to cry or do something more useful, and then she did something more useful. That had been 6 months ago, 6 months of drifting town to town across the Gulf states and into Texas, chasing rumors of work the way other people chase rivers, because work kept her moving. And moving kept her from sitting down somewhere and not getting back up. She'd cooked in boarding houses and cattle camp kitchens, and one deeply unpleasant week at a place that turned out not to be a hotel at all. She'd been underpaid, overlooked, talked down to, and told more than once that a young woman of her apparent quality ought to be looking for a husband rather than employment, as if the two were simply interchangeable categories of ambition. She left each situation as it turned untenable and moved toward the next. The name Weston Hale reached her in a town called Dutton's Crossing, where she'd spent 2 weeks cooking for a boarding house whose owner paid her half of what they'd agreed and called it a reasonable outcome. Since, as he explained, he hadn't expected the food to turn out quite so satisfactory, and now felt the original sum would have represented poor value on his end. She took what he gave her without argument, because arguing would have cost more time than the difference was worth, and went to sit in her rented room and count what remained and think hard about her next move. A widow named Opal Reyes knocked on her door that evening, the boarding house's one long-term resident, sharp-eyed, about 60. With a habit of speaking without preamble that Mara found refreshing after months of men, who needed 3 paragraphs to arrive at a single dishonest point. "You're leaving," Opal said, not a question. "Tomorrow morning. Anywhere to go?" "Not yet." Opal sat in the single chair without waiting to be asked, which Mara also found refreshing. "Heard you've been looking for real kitchen work, not just boarding house cooking." "I'm not particular anymore." "Hale Ranch," Opal said, "about 40 miles east of Cottonwood Bend. Biggest cattle operation in this part of the state. Weston Hale runs it. Lost his cook 3 weeks back, man named Abel Reese, been there 12 years. Just up and disappeared one morning without a word." "Why would a man leave somewhere 12 years without a word?" Opal's face did something interesting. "That's the question people ask. The answer they usually come back with isn't one that makes the job sound appealing. Tell me anyway." "Weston Hale's a hard man," Opal said. "Not cruel, nobody says cruel, but hard. Expects things done exactly so, doesn't explain himself, doesn't forgive mistakes the way most men eventually will if you wait them out. Reese was the best cook in 3 counties, and in 12 years Hale told him once the biscuits were acceptable. That was the highest praise the man ever got in that kitchen, and he left over that. He left because his sister in Kansas needed him," Opal said. "But the story I just told you is also true, and you ought to hold both in your head before you go riding out there." Mara thought it over. "Is he fair about wages?" "Yes." "About everything else," Opal considered, "he's fair the way an equation is fair. Doesn't take your feelings into account. Doesn't lie to you either. That's fine. I'm not looking for someone to consider my feelings. I'm looking for work." Opal wrote out directions and a letter of introduction that mattered more than Mara expected, because Opal was known across that part of Texas as a woman whose judgment could be trusted. And the letter was the difference between getting past the front gate and being turned away on the road. She found the road east and started walking. The ranch announced itself gradually: better fencing, heavier cattle, a road someone had actually maintained on purpose. She came around a long curve and saw it spread below a low rise, and stopped a moment, not from tiredness, but because it was bigger than she'd pictured, and held together by will alone in more than a few places. The main house was impressive, 2 stories of good timber. But the bunkhouses needed paint, One fence stretch had been patched with mismatched wire, signs of a place with more ambition than hands to serve it, working hard and still falling a little behind. She recognized that feeling intimately. The man at the gate was big, sunburned, and looked at her with the specific expression of someone who'd been told to expect nothing good from strangers and had found the advice consistently borne out. "Help you? I'm here about the cook position. My name's Mara Fontaine. I have a letter of introduction from Opal Ray's in Dutton's Crossing." The name landed, she watched it land, a small shift around his eyes. "Opal sent you." She did. He looked her over another moment, the bag, the worn boots, the recipe book still pressed to her chest because she hadn't found a moment to tuck it away safer. "Mr. Hale doesn't generally see people without an appointment. I understand that. But I've walked 40 miles in 3 days and don't have money for a trip back to anywhere, so I'd be grateful if you'd at least deliver the letter." He thought it over, then held out his hand. She gave him the letter and waited. He was gone about 8 minutes. When he came back, he swung the gate wider. "He'll see you in the main house," he said, in a tone that suggested he found the outcome personally surprising. She followed him across the yard, past two hands who stopped to watch her with frank curiosity. Past a barn full of the warm animal smell she'd always found reassuring for reasons she couldn't fully explain. The gateman knocked twice on the main house door and stepped back like he wanted no part of whatever came next. Weston Hale was taller than she'd pictured, lean from years of physical work, dark hair going silver at the temples. Eyes the flat, evaluating gray of a man who taught himself to look at things instead of people, because things held still and made sense. He held Opal's letter and studied Mara like a piece of land he was weighing. "Miss Fontaine, Mr. Hale, Opal says you're the best cook she's come across in 20 years of running boarding houses. She's not a woman who says things she doesn't mean." "No," Mara said. "And she doesn't send people your way without reason." His eyes dropped to the book against her chest. "What's that?" "My mother's recipe book. She died 8 months ago." Something crossed his face, dismissed fast. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said, in the tone of a man who meant it but had little practice saying so. He stepped back from the door. "Come in." The inside of the house matched the outside, impressive in its bones, worn at the edges. The home of a man who'd built something substantial and gotten so focused on holding it together that details had been let slide. He led her to an office, gestured to a chair, and sat behind a desk piled with papers organized to a precision that suggested either a very orderly mind or a very anxious one. "I feed 28 men 3 times a day," he said without preamble. "Kitchen starts at 4:30, last meals at 7, no day off during branding season. Wages $12 a month plus room and board." Mara did the arithmetic, "better than anything in 6 months. I understand. My last cook was here 12 years. Knew this kitchen, knew these men. I'm not looking for someone to experiment. I'm looking for someone reliable. I can do that. I've been cooking in a professional kitchen since I was 14, my family's restaurant, 11 years." She lifted the recipe book slightly. "I've been making these dishes longer than most of your hands have been shaving. You're confident. I'm accurate." Something shifted in his expression. Small enough she nearly missed it, recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. "All right, I'll give you one dinner tonight. Cook for 28 men with whatever's in the stores and I'll judge the result. If it's satisfactory, we'll talk permanent arrangement. If not, I'll pay you for the day and arrange a ride back." "Fair enough." He stood. "One of the hands will show you the kitchen." At the door he paused. "The men here work hard. They need food that means something, not just food that fills a plate. If you understand that distinction, you'll do well here." He left before she could answer. She stood a moment, holding her mother's book, and thought, he understands something about cooking most people never do. He just doesn't know he understands it. Then she picked up her bag and went to find the kitchen. It was enormous and a little chaotic, the particular disorder of a space run for years by someone who knew where everything was and then stopped maintaining it, leaving the rest of the household to work around a system that had only ever lived in one absent man's head. Cast iron pots big enough to feed an army, a wood stove that had clearly been somebody's pride, good shelves, reasonable stores of flour and dried beans, and salt pork and potatoes and onions and coffee. In the cold larder, a good quantity of beef, the kind of beef a man got when he ran the cattle himself. She stood in the middle of it and turned slowly, cataloging everything, and heard her mother's voice in memory, clear as if the woman stood beside her. You can make a meal out of almost anything if you understand what the person eating it actually needs. What do they need? She said aloud to the empty kitchen. She thought about Weston Hale's words. They're tired. They need food that means something. She thought about her parents' restaurant in Savannah, the people who came through it, what they looked like walking in and what they looked like walking out. Her mother had always said a good meal didn't just feed a body. It reminded a person they mattered to somebody, that someone had thought about them specifically, had taken the trouble. She opened her mother's book to a page she knew by heart and got to work. She had 4 hours before the evening meal and used every minute of them. The bread first, because bread needed time. And she knew from years of experience that real bread, not the hard, flat kind most camp kitchens turned out, could change the whole feeling of a room before another dish ever reached the table. While it rose, she worked the beef, a slow braise with onions and the dried herbs hanging above the stove, a technique her mother had used to make tough cuts tender and tender cuts unforgettable. 3 more dishes went up alongside it, and she moved between them with the efficiency of someone who'd cooked under pressure since childhood. A young ranch hand stuck his head in around 5 and stood there a long moment. Smells different in here. Good different or bad different? He thought about it with real seriousness. Good different, real good different. What are you making? Supper. Tell me something. What do the men here miss most? What they eat growing up that they don't get out here. He blinked, like nobody had ever asked him that. My mama made a sweet potato pie. Haven't had it since I left home. I don't have sweet potatoes, she said, but I've got something close. Tell the others supper's at 7 and they should come hungry. He left. She went back to work. By the time the hands started filing into the dining hall at 7, the smell filling the room was so different from what they'd been eating the past 3 weeks, since Reese left, and the cooking had fallen to whoever was least busy, which meant food that was edible and nothing more, that several stopped just inside the door and went still. The way people go still when something unexpected demands their whole attention. Mara had laid the food out the way her mother always did for a big gathering, not in a line to serve from, but spread down the long tables, so people had to reach past each other, had to talk. She'd set the bread in the center, because bread, in her professional judgment, was going to be what they remembered tomorrow. 28 men sat down. The first one to reach for the bread tore off a piece, put it in his mouth, stopped chewing for a full second, looked at the bread, then at Mara. "Ma'am, go ahead," she said. The room filled up, plates moved, dishes passed and passed again. And then the thing happened that Mara had seen happen in her mother's restaurant on the best nights. The room went quiet. Not an unhappy quiet, not boredom, but the specific hush of people so completely engaged with something that talk becomes briefly unnecessary. 28 tired, hard-worked, fairly cynical cowhands ate Mara Fontaine's first meal at Hale Ranch in near total silence. Then slowly, the talking started back up. Real talking, stories, laughter. 2 men who'd clearly been holding some quiet grudge now leaning across the table over the last of the braised beef, gesturing deep in it. She was clearing the near end of the table when she felt someone come into the room. Weston Hale stood in the doorway, looking at his men, not at the food, at them, at how they sat, how they talked, the particular quality of the noise. His face was unreadable in its usual way, but she was already learning the smaller signals, the slight tension near his eyes that meant he was more moved than he intended to look. He stayed in the doorway 30 seconds. Then he crossed to the end of the table nearest her, reached past without ceremony, took a piece of bread and ate it. He went very still. "Miss Fontaine," he said, "who taught you to cook like that?" She had the recipe book in her apron pocket. She touched it through the fabric, felt the worn cover, the faint raised edge of her mother's initials pressed into the leather 20 years back. "My mother." He looked at her a long moment with those gray eyes that weren't nearly as flat as they'd first appeared. "She taught you well." "Yes." "She did." He set down the rest of the bread and straightened. "The position's yours, Miss Fontaine, if you want it." She didn't hesitate. "I want it." "Good." He turned to go, then stopped. "The men will have questions tomorrow, who you are, where you came from. They'll be respectful, I require it, but they'll be curious." "That's fine." "Curiosity I can manage." Something in his face almost moved toward a smile. "Breakfast at 7, 4:30 start as discussed." "I'll be ready at 4. He left. Mara stood in the nearly empty dining hall as the last hands drifted out, a couple nodding as they passed, one boy no older than 18 pausing to say, "Best meal I've had since I left Kansas." "Ma'am." "I mean it," before disappearing into the evening. She felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months, and had to stop and name it carefully before she trusted it. For the first time since Savannah, she felt like she might be exactly where she was supposed to be. She held the recipe book in both hands. "I found us somewhere to stay a while, Mama. I think you'd like it here." Then she tucked it back into her apron and went to clean the kitchen for tomorrow's 4:30 start, because the feeling was real, but the work was also real. And she had never once in her life confused the two. "Before I go any further, has a plate of food ever done that to you? Made a whole room go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with manners? If you know exactly what I mean, you already understand why this story matters to the people who lived it. Stick with me, because what Mara Fontaine builds over the next 2 months is going to be tested harder than one good dinner." The next morning she learned something nobody had warned her about. The men didn't just have appetites, they had opinions. They came to breakfast fast and purposeful, and when the biscuits went around, the quality of the silence changed, appreciative rather than absent. She noticed a boy near the far end, maybe 19, the same one who told her about his mother's sweet potato pie, eating his biscuit like he was trying to memorize it. She refilled his coffee and said quietly, "All right." He looked up, eyes a shade too bright. "My grandmother used to make biscuits like this." "Don't know why I'm telling you that. Breakfast does it," she said, "every time." By the time Weston appeared at 6 sharp, she was already learning his rhythms. He sat, looked at his plate, then at her. "Started these at what time?" 4:45. He ate half a biscuit in one deliberate bite. "Better than Reese's," he said, in the tone of a man delivering a survey report rather than a compliment. "I know." Something crossed his face, the look of a man encountering something outside his original calculations. "You're very direct, Miss Fontaine. You told me last night you needed someone reliable. Reliable people tend to be direct." He studied her, then said, "Sit down. You've been on your feet since 4. Eat your own breakfast," reaching for his coffee like the instruction was purely practical. She considered arguing, considered that her feet did in fact hurt, and sat. "The man at the end," she said after a while, "third from the left, not eating much." "Dutch," Weston said. "Got a letter from home 10 days back. His father died." She looked at Dutch, maybe 40, weathered, holding himself with the stillness of a man managing something too big to put down. "Has anyone talked to him about it?" "He doesn't want to. I offered him time to go home for the burial." said there was nothing left to go home to. She thought about the 6 weeks after her own mother died, the way food had tasted wrong for a long time, not bad, just wrong. Like everything had been slightly mistranslated. I'll make something for him tonight. Miss Fontaine, you've been here 15 hours. I know what it's like to lose someone and have nowhere to put the grief, she said. That's enough. He held her gaze a beat longer than the exchange required, like something was being weighed that had nothing to do with competence. All right, he said and looked away. She spent the morning reorganizing the parts of the kitchen that Reese's system hadn't made obvious to anyone but Reese, and left the rest alone. A young hand named Danny Ruiz, 22, 3 years on the ranch, appeared in the doorway around 10. Mr. Hale wants to know if you need anything from town. Come in. Don't stand in the doorway. He came in uncertain, testing the new rules. Reese didn't like people in his kitchen. Reese isn't here. Tell Mr. Hale I need dried chilies, more salt pork, sweet potatoes if the store has them, and black-eyed peas if he can find any. Danny wrote it down with real seriousness. You're not from Texas. Reese was. Figured you had to understand the land to understand the food. He looked up. But last night was better than anything Reese ever made, so I'm revising my theory. She almost smiled. What's your new theory? That it's got nothing to do with where you're from, got to do with whether you're paying attention. That's exactly right, she said. Now go give Mr. Hale my list before that supply run leaves without it. He went. She thought about Dutch, and what her mother would have made for a man carrying that kind of weight, and settled on a stew with the sort of depth that took 3 hours to build properly, but arrived at the table like a conversation with someone who already knew your whole history. She made it that evening and set it in front of Dutch specifically rather than letting it come around with everything else. He looked at it, looked at her. Bay leaf. And something else. Worcestershire, she said. My mother's secret ingredient. She knew perfectly well it wasn't a secret. He picked up his spoon. 20 minutes later, she heard his voice behind her, standing, plate empty. Thank you, he said, and started again. My father used to make a stew like this before everything went wrong with our family. Don't know how you knew. I didn't, she said honestly. I made the kind of thing I'd want if I were sitting where you are. He nodded once, with the careful dignity of a man determined not to cry in a working dining hall. It was real good. There's more I made extra. Weston found her at the wash basin later. You made something different for Dutch. Why? Because he needed it and I could provide it. Those are the only 2 conditions I require. That's not how this ranch operates. This ranch runs on efficiency. A man who eats well works better, she said. A man who feels remembered works better still. That's efficiency. He was quiet a long while. Reese was here 12 years. Never once made something different for a specific man. Then Reese was an excellent cook, Mara said. I'm trying to be something more than that. That night set the pattern for the weeks that followed. She rose at 4, had breakfast ready by 5:45. The men adjusted to her the way working men adjust to a clear improvement, wary, then grateful, then fiercely protective in small ways. An old hand named Silas told a visiting livestock buyer, who made an ugly remark about Mara's age, that he could take his business elsewhere, and the ranch would manage fine without him. Danny told her about it 2 days later, and she felt something warm settle in her chest. But it was the table talk that taught her the most. She built what she thought of as a kind of listening architecture, never eavesdropping exactly, more like tending, and she learned things. She learned Weston had expanded the ranch aggressively 3 years back, taking on pasture to the east under terms that had looked fair at the time and looked less so now. She learned a man named Cyrus Deakins, who ran the neighboring spread to the north, had been dropping comments in town about the Hale operation. Nothing overtly hostile, just comments with edges. The kind meant to plant doubt before you'd given anyone a specific reason to doubt. She learned two of the eastern fence lines were in dispute, the details unclear to her, but clearly the thing underneath everything, because every time it came up at the table, voices dropped and eyes moved in a particular pattern. She didn't ask direct questions. She listened and she cooked. At the end of her first full week, Weston called her into his office. "You've changed things," he said. "Boone tells me the men are more productive. Silas told me yesterday this is the best year he can remember here. Silas doesn't say things like that." Fry came to me about an advance on his wages and actually explained his situation with a plan. First time in 8 months he's talked to me like an adult about it. She thought of Fry's shaking hands, the way he always sat near the door. "Debt shame makes a man want an exit route close by," she said. "Not rational, common." He looked at her the way he'd started to, recalibrating, discovering more layers than he'd first assessed. "Where'd you learn to notice things like that?" "My mother's restaurant. She said it was a study in human nature people paid you to observe, and the food you cook tells them something back. That's what cooking actually is if you do it right, a conversation." He was quiet a moment. "My wife," he said and stopped, as if surprised the sentence had started at all, "died 5 years ago." Used to say something like that. A meal was a form of care made physical. He said it with the flatness of a man who'd carried something so long, he'd learned to reference it without inflection. "I'd forgotten she said that until just now." "I'm sorry," Mara said, because it was true. "It was 5 years ago," he said, with the defensive arithmetic of a man who believed time should have made it smaller. "Doesn't matter how long ago," she said gently. "Some things don't do the math." He looked away, then changed direction with the decisiveness of a man closing a door he'd left open by accident. "There's something I should tell you. About the Eastern land. I've heard some of it, Cyrus Deacon's, fence disputes, expansion that looks different now than it did 3 years ago." His jaw tightened. "The men shouldn't discuss that with you." "They weren't discussing it with me. I happened to be there. I'm going to be in that dining hall 3 times a day, Mr. Hale. I can pretend I haven't heard things, or I can be useful with them." "I'd rather be useful." He studied her, then said, "Deakins claims my deed is defective, a prior agreement between his family and the previous landowner, never recorded. His lawyer's in Austin. Mine's in Cottonwood Bend." He let that sit. "He's already requested a meeting, next week, here." "Then let it happen in the dining hall," she said, "over a meal in front of the men. He'll walk in expecting to intimidate you in your own home, and instead he'll walk into a room full of people who belong here, and he'll be the one who doesn't fit. A man taking something from you loses his advantage the moment you put him somewhere that reminds him constantly whose place it is." Weston stared at her. "That's not what I expected you to say." "I'll take care of the menu too," she said. "That part goes without saying." He almost smiled. "Miss Fontaine, how is it you arrived here with 39 cents and no complaints about it?" "Complaining costs time I don't have," she said. "What are you deciding about me right now, Mr. Hale?" He was quiet, the lamp throwing unsteady light across a face that looked, for once like everyone else's, tired, uncertain, carrying more than he showed. "I think you might be exactly what this ranch needs," he said finally, "and I'm not certain what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," she said. "I'll be in the kitchen at 4. Cyrus Deakins arrived on a Tuesday, earlier than expected, exactly the sort of move meant to catch a household unprepared. Mara had 2 hours warning and used every minute of it, pulling Dutch in to peel potatoes at a speed she hadn't known a man could peel potatoes, and Silas to fetch the good linen. By noon, the dining hall looked like a place that had never known disorder in its life. Deakins was not what she expected, not the large, loud man from the table talk, but medium height, precisely dressed. A face arranged, since childhood, into pleasant reasonableness that never reached his eyes. 2 large men flanked him for presence. A small, neat lawyer with a document case positioned himself at his left. Deakins' eyes found Mara and stayed there. "You've added to your staff, Hale. Miss Fontaine runs my kitchen," Weston said, flat and quiet. "A woman. A cook. Sit down." The meal went the way she'd planned, Deakins accepting hospitality he hadn't come for, losing his footing an inch at a time for it. Near the end, she heard his lawyer murmur to one of the big men, something about the Ashby deed, before the clerk's records were transferred, before dropping his voice too low to follow. She carried the plates back and stood with her hands flat on the table, turning it over. The Ashby deed, before the clerk's records were transferred. She didn't know Texas land law well enough to say exactly what that meant. But she knew the difference between how men talked about something legitimate and how they talked about something built to say one particular thing at one particular time. She went back out. The conversation had turned serious. Deakins' lawyer was laying out an agreement, supposedly predating Weston's deed by 18 months, never recorded at the time, but with witnesses, 2 of them Hale Ranch employees. "That's not the same as independent witnesses," Weston said. "The law doesn't require independence," the lawyer said mildly. "Only attestation. It also requires the agreement be in writing to stand against a recorded deed," said Boone, the foreman, speaking for the first time. A pause. "There is a written document. Produced when?" Weston said. "When did it enter the record?" "March," the lawyer admitted. "Of this year. The clerk's records for this district," Boone said, "were moved to the new courthouse in February, 3 weeks, roughly, unsupervised." The room went very quiet. Deakins' pleasant expression didn't move, but something behind it tightened. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm noting a timeline," Boone said. Mara, refilling water, passed behind Deakins' chair and saw what nobody else could, his hand pressed flat against his thigh. The only visible sign the conversation wasn't going as planned. Deakins left with hollow courtesies. Boone stayed at the table after, and when Mara came to clear the last plates he said, without looking up, "Ashby's nephew. Could be very useful if he knows the document's forged." He looked at her. "How long have you been paying attention to what gets said at that table?" "Since the first morning." "Didn't know it'd be useful. Just didn't see the point in not paying attention." Boone nodded once, with the finality of a decision. "I'm going to find him before Deakins does. Before I go further, I want you to sit with something for a second. Because this is the part of the story that, the first time I heard it, made me put my phone down and just stare at the wall a minute. If you like to guess ahead, now's the moment. I promise you it isn't what you think." Boone rode back 3 days later with a man named Warren Ashby, nephew of the late Elias Ashby, whose name sat on the forged document. Ashby confirmed what they'd hoped. His uncle had refused to sign any such agreement with Deakins' father twice over the water rights. He'd sell the land before he'd give up the water, he'd said. But there was a complication. Warren was in debt, badly, to a man in a nearby town who happened to be tied to Deakins' business interests. Nobody had paid him to lie. He'd simply been given a reason to stay quiet. If Deakins' claim succeeded, the settlement would clear his debt. "He's not a villain," Boone said. "He's desperate." Mara knew what desperate felt like. She knew the calculations a desperate person made, the way survival narrowed your options until you forgot there'd ever been more room to move. "How much is the debt?" she asked. "About $200. "Then cover it," she said to Weston, "not as payment for testimony. Tell him it's a loan, no interest, payable whenever he's able, and mean it." Weston studied her. "You want me to loan money to a man I've never met, who's currently the only witness who can save this ranch. I want you to help a desperate man because he needs help and you're able to give it. What he does after that is between him and his own conscience." She held his gaze. "I believe a man given a reason to think decent people exist is more likely to behave decently himself. I also believe it's the right thing to do regardless of the outcome. But yes, I think he'll testify. Warren Ashby came back with Boone 2 days later and stayed at the ranch while the case moved through the territorial court. He told the lawyer everything, his uncle's refusal, the signature that didn't match, the whole of it, and at dinner that first night when the sweet dish came around. He looked up and found Mara across the room. "Who made this?" "Miss Fontaine," Boone said. "My mother used to make something like it," Warren said quietly, "before she passed." "I'm glad," Mara said. "I'm sure she was too. The document was ruled a forgery." Deakins' own lawyer distanced himself from the case once the transit record timeline came out, and when Deakins showed up at the ranch a final time, not for dinner, unannounced. Through the front gate, with the thin edge of a man whose plan had already come apart, Weston met him in the yard. "You'll speak to Miss Fontaine with respect," Weston told him, quiet and final, "or you'll get off my land before I help you do it." Deakins looked between them both and understood. In the particular way men like him eventually understand, that the woman he hadn't taken seriously had been the problem all along. He left, he didn't come back. The eastern pasture was confirmed as Hale land. Warren went home with his uncle's name restored and his debt cleared, and told Mara at the gate that he didn't know what was in that sweet dish the first night. But he figured it was what started all of it. She told him it was just brown sugar and pecans. He said he figured it was something more than that. She thought he was right. What came after unfolded the way things do, when they've been building a long while and finally arrive with a sense of rightness, rather than surprise. She started a Sunday dinner open to the whole community, cooking for far more people than showed up the first week, and exactly the right number by the fourth. When word had spread the way good things spread in small towns, quietly, person to person, until 40 people were crowding 2 extra tables and Boone had 3 hands on serving duty. Danny Ruiz kept turning up to help until helping became learning. Silas started combing his hair different on Sundays around the time. A widow named Adeline began showing up regular with strong opinions about pie crust that Mara found, on testing, were entirely correct. And some mornings before dawn, when sleep failed him, Weston came and sat in the kitchen with her mother's recipe book open in front of him. Reading the handwriting the way a man reads something that matters. It was in that kitchen at 4 in the morning, 8 weeks after she'd first walked through his gate, that he asked her to marry him, not for what she'd done for the ranch, though she had. And not because she'd solved his hardest problems, though she'd solved most of them, but because he'd spent 5 years going through the motions of a life and hadn't understood that fully until she walked through his gate with 39 cents and her mother's book and looked back at the men outside that saloon until they looked away first. "Because I love you," he said, "and I believe that's sufficient reason." She said yes, and then said it again because once wasn't enough for something this true. She opened her mother's recipe book to the blank final page that evening, the page her mother had always said she was saving for something and had died before filling. Mara understood it now. Not a recipe, a place to start something new. She wrote at the top in her own tight hand, Cottonwood Bend, Texas, Hale Ranch, the beginning of what comes next. She wrote his name, then hers beside it, and closed the book, and put it back on its shelf where it belonged. She'd walked into that gate with 39 cents and the plan to survive one winter. She hadn't planned on building a home. She hadn't planned on a table that got one place longer every season, or a young man learning to cook, or an old man growing soft around a widow with opinions about butter, or a husband who came to her kitchen at dawn because it was the only place his grief and his hope both made sense at once. That was her mother's legacy, passed on without either of them ever quite calling it that. Feed people, remind them they matter. Build warmth in places that have gone cold, and keep building it, every single morning without stopping. And every day after, when the kitchen fire came alive before sunrise and the smell of good bread drifted out across the yard and into the Texas morning, the people of Cottonwood Bend knew, without being told, that the woman they'd once have overlooked at a roadside was still there, still cooking, still paying attention, and that the richest ranch in the county was, by then, rich in every way that actually counted. If this one stayed with you, if a woman with 39 cents and her mother's handwriting felt like exactly the kind of stubborn you needed to hear about tonight, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me honestly whether you'd have stood up the way she did. Hit like, subscribe if this is your first time here, and I'll see you in the next one.